Hello, everyone. Welcome to Class 10, Storytelling in Gamespaces and the Ordering of Principles in Architecture. So from the syllabus, we're going to be doing an architectural approach to level design, chapter 10, talking about possibility spaces in world building. In class, we'll also talk about a few of your patterns. Should be able to do that this week. We have a little less to go over from the chapter. And the lecture topics will be the ordering principles in architecture, which are listed here. Talk about those in just a second. And in our class activity, we're going to be linking of patterns again, and this time specifically working on keywords. You'll be creating those both for your patterns and then in another exercise for your project. And then using those two things to search for more patterns. For your project, you're going to be using the pattern language you've created so far to design a scene for a game that solves the design problem that you defined in class. You won't, again, be beginning your actual in-engine production of that scene. You're just going to be working on design this week and documenting that design. Now, the ordering principles in architecture. There, again, people have different lists for this from time to time, but primarily those are defined as axis, symmetry, repetition and rhythm, datum, hierarchy, and transformation. Datum is a weird one. What exactly do we mean by that? But we'll get there shortly. So the coming slides are taken from the blog Composting Thoughts, and it presented a really good visual presentation for these. And so I borrowed it for class. So thank you to them. All right, axis. So an axis in this case is a line established by 2 points in space, sure, about which forms and spaces can be arranged in a symmetrical and balanced manner. Okay, so in the picture here, we see that this architectural structure is formed around two different axes. So one of those would be the horizon line. And things being organized from left to right on the horizon line. Things on above it, things below it. And then the second is that central line we see driving up through the center of the structure, and things being ordered on the left and right of that line going backwards into perspective, right? So each of those structures you see on either side of that central axis progressing towards the distance is ordered along that axis away from us. So multiple axes in that drawing, or in that picture. In games, we think about ordering things along an axis in terms of a side scroller being a horizontal axis, or bullet hell shooter where you're going up the screen being along a vertical axis. When you're designing a game level, you might be ordering things, along a axis in terms of how the game levels are related to each other. You might be in an open world ordering things along the axis of a road that you have running through your game world. So this is something that comes up all the time. And you should be thinking about what are the axes of your level, what are the axes of your world. It could even apply to mechanics. What's the axis of progression for your mechanics? Do they progress along one axis or multiple? A little bit more abstract, but something to think about. All right, symmetry, a balanced distribution and arrangement of equivalent forms and spaces about opposite sides of a dividing line or plane, or about a center or axis. So symmetry can be along an axis, or it could be around a center, and equivalent forms and spaces is important. This doesn't have to be a mirror image in order for the figure to exhibit symmetry. So you could have something that is a mirror, like in the illustration there, or you could have had, say, that square and circle on the bottom reversed, and you would still have something that was exhibiting symmetry that was imperfect. That principle can be more or less strongly present in a given state. Also, dividing line or plane. So this can be applied in a three-dimensional kind of space as well, things being symmetrical, more two-dimensional planes being symmetrical to each other. If you imagined a reflection in a pool, the reflection is providing symmetry on two different planes. Yeah. So again, when you're designing spaces, symmetry is an ordering principle. Too much symmetry can make things boring and samey, but providing symmetry gives our brains a way to grasp complex structures. So we use symmetry a lot. We'll be talking about more complex forms of symmetry when we talk about Christopher Alexander's 15 properties, fundamental properties of wholeness, in a future class. But this is the basic concept. All right, repetition and rhythm. So a unifying movement characterized by a patterned repetition or alteration of formal elements or motifs in the same or modified form. So if you look at that picture there, you could imagine that skyscraper being straight and you still having rhythm in that you have blocks of windows that are repeating, alternating with those breaks between them, and that would create a sense of rhythm. It would even have a bit of a sense of movement, as because the top's further away and smaller, you would have sort of a vertical movement as the thing gets smaller going up. But when you apply that twist to it, you create more sense of motion, and that alteration in the way that we perceive those blocks, that change, is still creating a sense of rhythm. It's just a more complex rhythm that feels more dynamic. So if you think about, also you look at the diagram there, you see a bunch of blocks that are repeating, and then that style of repetition changes, the space between them, or missing blocks, and then it changes again into rotating blocks. And so that progression, that sense of change, can create more complex rhythms. Rhythms don't just have to be beat, 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 beat forever. In terms of gameplay, if you think of something like a fight and rest sequence, you could have fight, rest, fight, rest, fight, rest. Okay, sure, that's a rhythm. But you could also have the level starting out, fight, rest, and then going to fight, rest, and then going to fight, rest, fight, rest, and then going to fight, rest, and then going to fight, boss. And that complex rhythmic progression of combat would build intensity in a way that is going to be more engaging, build toward the crescendo of a boss fight in a way that's more satisfying than just alternating back and forth. So the rhythm can be complicated, and repetition becomes rhythm when you start doing something more interesting with it, either alternating repetition or progressing repetition. So you can do those kind of things in games. The architecture you design literally may exhibit these things. The overall level design may exhibit this, or should probably exhibit this. And certainly the gameplay is going to be using that spatial arrangement to help you build rhythm in terms of the gameplay. Datum. Now here's a weird one. All right, so datum, what do we mean by that? A line, plane, or volume that by its continuity and regularity serves to gather, measure, and organize a pattern of forms and spaces. Cool. So again, we have axis, right? But when we've been talking about rhythm and we've been talking about symmetry, we're saying these regular forms that are repeated or mirrored. What if you have chaos of stuff, right? Look at that house, right? It's just, it's not a mess, but it's all of these different shapes glommed together. How does it appear coherent? Well, it's using the datum, in this case, the axis of the roof line of that building, to organize all of these other shapes around. And so if you didn't have that central dividing line, that axis being used to gather and measure and organize all of those other shapes, if you didn't have, again, a second datum of the reflection into the pool to organize the above and below shapes into symmetry to provide this sense of organization, right? If you just had just had the building without the reflection, and you didn't have that roof line was broken by some of those shapes, it would just be like somebody wadded up a bunch of pieces of paper and threw them together, and you had the Stata building. It was chaos. But it isn't chaos. It's this beautifully organized space, even though the shapes are very chaotic, because it's organized on these different lines of symmetry that allow you to understand and perceive all of that chaos in an orderly way. So again, the illustration is a good way of showing that, and the picture is very good. So when you're having a chaotic level design, right, you're having a lot of different shapes of rooms, different things going on, organizing those along a central hallway, or if you have a lot of different stuff geographically going on, organizing all of that geography along a horizon line, so the player has a way to look across all of those different biomes and say, I see how these things are ordered, even though they're individually very chaotic and different from one another. So it's important to provide that framework for player understanding. Right, so again, imageability is improved by Datum. All right, hierarchy. So a couple of different kinds of hierarchy. This has come up in some of your patterns in the past. We've been talking about things like, we put the bad guy in a castle at the top of the mountain, or at the bottom of the dungeon, providing a sense of hierarchy in terms of your challenges. Monsters get harder the further up or down you go in a hierarchy. So that absolutely is, it's what's being shown in that first image there, where the books at the top are given priority over the books at the bottom because of this hierarchical arrangement. Those seem more interesting maybe at the top. So that's one kind of hierarchy, but then also the articulation or importance of the importance or significance of a form by its space, shape, or placement relative to other forms and spaces in the organization. So then you get to the illustration there, where that unique square with the circle inside of it there, we know it's important because it's different from the others. It has a circle inside it. Its orientation is different from the others. It's has vertical orientation rather than diagonal, and it's broken out from the group a little bit, setting it apart. It's still connected to the group, but it's not like the other squares, right? If we changed any of those things, we would be reducing its level of importance to us. If it didn't have a circle inside of it, it would appear less different and important. If it was oriented with that block of things, if it fit in nicely, it would still seem like the most important one, but it would be less called out. So all of those pieces come together to, also it's at the top of the image, right? It does have that vertical hierarchy. So if we rotated that image by 90 degrees, it would be called out less. It would seem less important. Different maybe, but not on the top. So you have both the vertical spatial arrangement of hierarchy, but then also difference from the other things. And all of those things go together to help us read that, right? If we flipped it around and removed the circle, we might say, oh, actually, maybe that one is sort of falling off of the group, and maybe that makes it less important than the others, rather than being the most important one. So we use all these different things together to make something seem important, right? So the boss is bigger than everybody else. He's also located at the top of the level. Also, the boss room looks different than everything else that you have fought through so far. All of those things are combining to tell us that he's the most important thing that we've dealt with. So you need to think about hierarchy as you're doing all of your level design, right? You don't want to put important bosses in small side rooms halfway through the level, right? You're going to put them in places where they're going to be easily imaged as being important to the game. Maybe an optional boss is in a side room, and I know he's optional because he's off the main path, because he's not at the end of the level. All of these are, contributing to your language that you're using to communicate with your level. And transformation. So this one in architecture is a little weird. So the principle that an architectural concept, structure, or organization can be altered through a series of discrete manipulations and permutations in response to specific context or set of conditions without loss of identity or concept. This one's a little bit of a harder sell for architecture, right? Because like architecture tends to be pretty static in the real world. You have weird things like that image where you have this wall that actually changes shape in response to people's interactions with it. But that's like almost an art piece, not useful architecture. But we do see it in architecture. If you think of a conference building that has a bunch of hanging walls that from conference to conference, from day to day during a conference, those are shifted around to create different spaces as needed within a larger architectural structure, without losing the fact that, like, you're in the conference center at any point. If you ever go to GDC and go to the Moscone Center, each year the structure is organized differently inside, but it all still feels like the same space. It doesn't lose its identity or the concept that it's a conference center just because we're reconfiguring it all the time. You see that, in your living room, right? The difference between your living room at Christmas with a Christmas tree, and presents gathered around it, and a fire, versus the summer when all the windows are open and, it's a lighter, airier space, and, all of those things are cleaned out, and maybe you've put down a runner so that you don't get water from the pool all across your living room. We're constantly changing that space. It's still your living room, right? It's still the center of your home, but it looks different depending on what's going on. So we do that all the time. If you think of games, this becomes much more relevant. You have a situation where psychogeography comes into play, right? We have a level and we're going to encounter it a number of times during the game. And those different encounters with that space are going to have a different impact on the player because they're at different places in the journey of the story. But also we're going to reconfigure that space, right? It's going to look different each time you come back there. You're still going to know that you're passing through your hometown, even though the first time you pass through it you're sneaking out, and the second time you pass through it it's on fire, and the third time you pass through it you've helped rebuild it, and the fourth time you pass through it you're returning to your family at the end of your journey, and all the buildings are older and more worn down or whatever. Each of those spaces is visually and structurally different from each other. It's always the same space. It's serving different purposes, but it can change without losing a sense of what it is. Its genius loci is a term that I think we'll talk about at some point later in class. Maybe even we already talked about it. It might have been in the first chapter. But the spirit of the space doesn't change even though it is reconfigured. So space can transform. Certainly level spaces can transform all the time as we're moving through them, right? I mean, moving platforms doesn't change what the place is just because its platforms are moving. All right. So then we'll do our show and tell. Everybody's going to be presenting their design problems this week. So be prepared to present your design problem. Each member of your team is going to need to present the pattern that you did. So make sure you have your pattern ready to share. You should have entered it into the library. We're going to go through and do screen shares of these. We're going to be moving along as quickly as possible because there's 19 of you that need to share them, plus each group sharing their pattern. I don't want to take all class with this, so be ready. All right. Now then, readings and discussion, there'll be a little bit more than this, but this is pretty much what that will look like. So pause it if you want to review and make sure that you have an answer prepared for whichever of these I call on you to speak to. Also, be prepared to talk about your pattern because there are fewer of things to talk about this week than there are people. So I should get to some patterns. And then exercises in class, we're going to apply those ordering principles to games. So that'll be an individual exercise, not too long. And then we're going to assign keywords to your patterns. And then you're going to assign keywords to your project so that you can connect the two. Your project assignment is going to be, to review the patterns, use the new keywords to find new patterns. You're going to be creating a high-level concept for your game, paragraph to a page description. This should be writing. I want you to write about what kind of game you're making. And then you're going to pick a scene from that game that you're actually going to focus on. So I want you to frame your scene in a larger context. You aren't just designing a scene in isolation. You're designing a scene that is part of a level, that is part of a game. Think about the whole game, and then think about what part you're going to actually create for class. Figure out which patterns apply to that scene. Some patterns you selected might apply to the overall game, but not be relevant to your current scene. So you may mark some of them, don't delete them, but you may mark some of them as ones you're not going to use. And then you're going to use the ones that remain to try to design that scene in as much detail as possible, using, after you've gotten your description, using diagrams, illustrations. I'd like to see an improvement. Some of the art that I've seen in the last couple of weeks has been pretty thrown together. Sketches are fine to start out with, but put some thought into them. And you maybe some concept art, you may be grabbing that from Pinterest or whatever. You may be actually illustrating that yourself if possible. And then you're going to document that in your group final project document that you'll be working on. You'll be putting that into your individual documents together. But do not implement your design this week. Do not start building it in Engine. This is all still structural work getting ready. All right, and then again, your assignments will be reading a paragraph, writing a paragraph in response to each of the readings, which will be chapter 11, the 15 properties PDF, which I've included, but also that is in the book. So the 15 properties of wholeness applied to game design chapter in the book, and Jesse Schell's talk about the 15 properties as well. So that's another thing to listen to for this week. He's really engaging, wrote Art of Game Design, great guy. Should be an enjoyable talk to listen to. You'll be working on exercises 22 through 24 at home. And then your project will be obviously to present your progress next week. All right. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you all in class.